लड़ाई रहती है जिसको आपको लड़ना होता है, दिमाग में भी। आप लेट नाइट ड्यूटीज, हमारे आवर्स और लोगों की तरह बहुत कंफर्टेबल नहीं होते, हम 2-2 3-3 बजे भी रात को फिर पहुंचते हैं, हमारा स्लीप साइकिल खराब होता है, लेकिन हम फिर भी सुबह उठ जाते हैं और अपने परिवार को भी देखते हैं। तो महिलाओं के लिए जर्नलिज्म जो है बहुत इंटरेस्टिंग फील्ड है। मैं इनकरेज करूंगी, और मैंने जब देखा कि बहुत सारे यूनिवर्सिटीज में बच्चे, अब यूनिवर्सिटीज में स्टूडेंट्स जो हैं वो जर्नलिज्म को चुनते हैं, मुझे अच्छा लगता है, क्योंकि 27-28 साल पहले बहुत कम महिलाएं होती थी न्यूज रूम्स में, पुरुषों का ही बाहुल्य होता था। वो कैसे बातें करेंगे, फितरे कसेंगे, मजाक करेंगे, एंड यू जस्ट हैव टू लुक वेग, अच्छा मुझे समझ नहीं आएगा। अब नहीं हो सकता है, खासकर जब से मी टू कैंपेन्स बिल्डअप हुए हैं, तब से लोग थोड़ा डरने लगे, और मुझे लगता है महिलाओं को और स्ट्रांगली इन चीजों को, इन मुद्दों पे अपनी बात को बहुत जोर शोर से रखना चाहिए, ताकि आगे भी कोई भी महिला को न्यूज रूम में आने से कोई उनके लिए कोई बाधा ना बने। बेडर माता पिता भी जब चाहे कि उनकी बेटी जर्नलिस्ट बन रही है, तो उन्हें ये डर नहीं रहे कि अच्छा जर्नलिज्म में तो ऐसा होता है। No, it's quite safe. You have to fight for your space, and we'll all fight for our space. But I think my colleagues and all of the panelists will discuss a lot of things on gender and journalism. And I stop myself here. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. And IWPC is really, really happy to collaborate with Raisina House on this.
Thank you, ma'am. I would now like to invite Rahul Banerjee, MD Raisina House, to deliver the welcome address on behalf of Raisina House.
Thank you, Astha. Hi, a very good evening, everyone. Esteemed members of the Indian Women's Press Corps, my fellow colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I, on behalf of everyone at Raisina House, take this opportunity to welcome you all for this joint virtual dialogue session discussing gender in journalism, being organized in collaboration with the Indian Women's Press Corps. It is an honor for us to have Ms. Smita Sharma as the session chair for the evening, and it's an absolute privilege to have Dr. Natasha Kaul, Ms. Mandira Nair, and Ms. Pratibha Jyoti as key speakers in the panel for the evening. Marking 30 years of the Windhoek Declaration, May 3rd is observed as the World Press Freedom Day. The day is observed as a mark of support for media, which are targets of the restraint or abolition of press freedom. It is also a day of remembrance for those journalists who lost their lives in pursuit of a story. Gender equation in journalism till date remains an aspect in the profession that has almost always been overlooked. Today, it is important to discuss an attempt to make sure that journalism empowers all and leaves no one behind, not even the ones in the profession. Without any further ado, I hand over the proceedings back to Astha. Thank you, Astha.
Thank you, Rahul. I now have the pleasure of introducing our panelists. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Smita Sharma, who is the contributing editor and host of People's Editor, India Ahead News, and managing committee member at IWPC. I am pleased to welcome our key speaker for the evening, Dr. Natasha Kaul. Dr. Kaul is an academic author and economist. We have the honor of being joined by Ms. Mandira Nair. She is a senior special correspondent, The Week magazine, and the vice president at IWPC. Last but not the least, I am extremely honored to introduce Ms. Pratibha Jyoti, an independent journalist and member of the managing committee, IWPC. With this, I would like to hand over the session to Ms. Smita Sharma, the session chair of the evening.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I hope I'm audible and clear.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, lovely. Thank you so much, Astha, Rahul, Raisina House, Vinita Pandey, the entire IWPC team for this collaboration, which is happening at a very, very critical juncture and a timing. I think it's very important, keeping in mind what all of us are collectively going through as individuals going through amid a pandemic, as if the challenges of journalism weren't enough, that we now have a pandemic that has taken an emotional, mental, physical toll on each of us. And as I start this session, in fact, if I could just request each of you to join me just for a moment's silence, because I know while we are going to talk about gender in journalism, coronavirus, unfortunately, is something that has been a leveler, which hasn't looked at caste, class, religion, or sex. And We have lost more than 145 journalists and still counting, young and old, to the pandemic today in the last few months. Every morning we have been waking up to the horror of losing out colleagues, young and old, people in their 30s, journalists in their 20s, to veterans, to this virus. And unfortunately, despite the nature of our job, it's only 1 or 2 states now that have declared us as frontline workers, which means that we can be vaccinated on priority, but it's not the case nationwide. Maybe if we could just keep a 30-second of momentary silence before I start this conversation, and just keep all those who are no more with us in our newsrooms in our thoughts today. Thank you so much, everyone. These are difficult times, but I'm glad that Raisina House, which I'm told has a very, very young audience and a lot of young scholars, students, all so keen to hear others and learn about issues and also write papers themselves. So a welcome to all the one stellar journalists who I'm lucky to be moderating this panel with: Pratibha, Mandira, Dr. Natasha Kaul. And I think, when you talk about gender in journalism, just to give you very briefly about myself, I've been in journalism for almost 18 years now. And I've had the unique privilege of actually working through some very leading television, print, digital media houses. So I've worked across platforms. I've worked across languages. I've been a foreign policy in charge, primetime anchor in English and Hindi. I've been writing on foreign policy security issues. So that's helped me give a unique perspective of the industry in seeing it up close and personal. And I'll begin by saying something. So very recently, just few months back, I was actually invited to be on the jury of a prominent award, which is a news award. And trust me, when I went through the entries of the shows that had been sent into that award, it was a horror for me. Because jitne TV shows aaye the, in all of them, I think in the 100, maybe there was just 2% entries that were either not manuals, that had some sort of a significant women representation, or the women anchors were not trying to imitate each other because, there's a certain sort of expectation that is put into the newsroom, especially in TV and digital. When you enter the newsroom as a young rookie reporter, the men too, all, on the panels, even which had women, I didn't see women representation. And this has been a struggle for me continuously in newsrooms. I have had fights with people on assignment, on news coordination, in trying to drive home the point that how can you discuss everything under the sun, from a national to an international policy, security to health, without having informed women representation on your panels. That's missing. And it's not something that even in the 21st century, even in the current social media networked era, our newsrooms are still trying to do. It's perhaps not such a visible problem for print. In TV, the nature is very different. So in TV, it is visible, but in print too, or in digital too. And I was actually going through, just to set the ball rolling. And then what I'll do is perhaps I'll go to each speaker. Maybe for the first 2-3 minutes, you could just share some anecdotal experience of how your journalism career has been. And then I'll start the Q&A. And I hope, because normally I'm a little skeptical about when we are in a room on a panel where, if it's not a panel, it becomes an all-women panel. I'm always afraid that we may end up preaching to the choir. We don't want to do that. So I'll be more than happy to take questions from all the male voices in the room as well, since we don't have a male speaker here. But there was a report in 2019 that came out, which spoke about the gender inequality in Indian media. This is by the Pari Network, and it was, it discussed the women's representation in newsrooms of English and Hindi in India. It was published by the UN Women. So some of the key findings in that report, and this is 2019, just less than 2 years back, they had studied 55 news organizations. Women held 13.6% of the leadership positions in magazines, 20.9% in news channels, 26.3% in digital media outlets, and none in newspapers. So I think it speaks volumes about where we are. Over 70% of debates on 7 Hindi news channels, which were Aaj Tak, News 18, India TV, Republic Bharat, they featured all male panels. And only 3.2% of all flagship debates were actually on gender issues. So when we look at the gender prism, it's a broad prism. It's about, of course, the kind of gender biases that we have faced at a personal level, the inadvertent biases that we may be bringing to the newsrooms, the leadership challenges, to the assignment challenges, to the physical risks. Because in journalism, of course, this is a very common question that I get asked, that did you get discriminated because you were a woman journalist? Were your risks higher than a male journalist? And these are all questions that, frankly, I don't have a clear answer to. So let me begin by asking you, Mandira, first. Give us a sense of your career so far. You've also had a long-standing career. Do you recall any incidents, which you would like to share with the group today, which takes you back to this question of, ma'am, how was it being a woman journalist?
Well, I started my career at a point of time, and I think, Vinita talked about and I got knocked off at that point of time, starting off as a sports journalist, right? And then she said something to the effect of, now it's very encouraging that young women want to become journalists. I came at a point of time when, if you liked Hindi movies and wanted to never wake up late, the only option you really had was to become a journalist. Okay. That was what it was. Now everybody wants to choose journalism also because of social media, television, things like that. And it's sort of become a glamorous profession. It's become, look at web series. The most glamorous element is a woman journalist. We've become like the it thing, right? And the it profession to become a woman journalist. We break stories, we change the world, we sort of make governments crumble. Of course, nothing like this happens, but you know what I mean? That's the difference from where I'm missing. I joined the Hindu, it was my first job. I was idealistic, and I think I came into a point of time when, and you've talked about this, Smita, I came at a point of time when you never said rape. Women were never raped. You were criminally assaulted. I remember it was because it was offending to actually say the word rape. You didn't want to offend readers. So you actually said criminally assaulted. From then to now, where you can discuss everything under the sun. I mean, I think I've worked with papers that I worked with the Hindu for 5 years. I like to say I specialize in regional giants. I worked in the Telegraph for 1. And then I've been working with the Week for about 13 years, which is a really, really long stint. The newsroom has changed. It is, things have changed. Even Malayalam Manorama, which is our parent group, didn't have a woman journalist for many, many years. And K.R. Meera was the first woman journalist who broke that bastion. So there's a lot of change that has happened within the newsroom itself. From heartbeats to young listening. I remember when you started off, crime was never a beat that they never gave. Women were given, to now foreign policy, where we are voices. I think if you look at it, the strongest voices in foreign policy will be women journalists. There are certain beats that have been cultivated by women, and that's where I come from. I think I do culture. I do foreign policy, and I do in-depth features, which is of course been always the domain of women, right? Features and soft stories. So that's what I've come from. But I think there has been, over the years, there has been a certain acknowledgement of women journalists in the profession as professionals, as people who will go faster. I think there is an aspect of women's guilt. I see that throughout. I worked in 2 papers that have been giants in the South. There is a certain, while there is a certain respect for women in the South, and I must say there is, I'm not making a sweeping broad statement. I'm saying that there is a certain aspect of that, but there is also a certain aspect of patriarchy that I think all newsrooms have, maybe a little more in some. So I think that's a challenge. I don't think that's a bastion we've broken. There is a glass ceiling completely. Hindu had, after my time, of course, a woman editor who was also an owner. Now they have a very articulate and incredibly strong woman, Suhasini Haidar, who's very much on top. But women still don't make decisions. Women still, there is a glass ceiling. I think the Me Too debate has pitted women across genders, across generations, right? But I think feminism is still a bad word. So I mean, those are the things that I still think this thing. I don't know whether I've overshot my thing, but
okay. So so a couple of things that of course you've mentioned there, from how things have changed. The language, of course, when we talk about gender in any, I think the language becomes very key, and gender in journalism also does encompass the use of language, how you to represent a story, to write a story. Pratibha, आपकी भी जो अपनी इनिंग्स रही हैं अभी तक, और आपने तो किताब भी लिखी है एसिड वाली लड़की, थोड़ा आप शुरुआती कमेंट्स बताएं, आपके लिए ये सफर कैसा रहा जब आपने शुरुआत की थी और आज? अभी तो आप इंडिपेंडेंट जर्नलिस्ट हैं, लेकिन एक या दो जो बातें आपको लगता है सही में चेंज हुई हैं न्यूज रूम्स में इस दौरान?
थैंक यू स्मिता जी। मेरा स्ट्रगल तो उसी दिन शुरू हो गया जिस दिन मैंने बिहार से ट्रेन पकड़ी थी दिल्ली आने के लिए। मकसद था कि जर्नलिज्म करना है, मीडिया में जाना है। कुछ नहीं पता था, और न हमारे घर वालों को पता था, न हमारे मोहल्ले को। हमारे छोटे से शहर से, बहुत छोटा सा शहर है बिहार का, जहाँ से मैं बिलोंग करती हूँ, और दिल में अरमान थे कि पत्रकारिता करनी है, जर्नलिज्म करना है। कोई खास आदर्श नहीं था मेरा, लेकिन मेरा मन था कि मैं कुछ लिखूं, कुछ करूं। और शायद एसिड वाली लड़की जो निकल के आई, उसी का रिजल्ट है कि जो मेरे मन में थी बात की, कहीं ना कहीं मैं कुछ लिखूं, ऐसा करूं जो सोसाइटी को कुछ दे कर जाए। तो मेरा स्ट्रगल उस दिन से था जिस दिन बिहार से मैंने ट्रेन पकड़ी, और फिर मेरे पीछे मेरे घर वालों को कहा गया, ये क्या, लड़की को पत्रकार बना रहे हैं, क्या होगा उसका, आपको पता भी है। बहुत बातें सुनी मम्मी और पापा ने, लेकिन खैर स्मिता जी, आप और हम दोनों जामिया से ही हम लोग पढ़ के निकले हैं, तो आपको पता है जामिया का अपना अलग मेरा स्ट्रगल रहा।
एक्चुअली मैं IIMC से थी।
IIMC, सॉरी, ओके। तो जब हमारा स्ट्रगल क्लासरूम में भी था, जो क्लासमेट थे मेल, वो भी, अरे आप लोग क्यों आ गए इसमें, क्या करना है यहाँ के। तो स्ट्रगल तो पहले दिन से था। यहाँ मैं एक खास बात बताना चाहती हूँ कि हिंदी और अंग्रेजी जो एक डिस्क्रिमिनेशन जो हिंदी के साथ है, वही हिंदी पत्रकारों के साथ भी है, हिंदी मीडिया के साथ भी है। हिंदी मीडिया, मैं मानती हूँ कि अंग्रेजी में जो लड़कियां आ रही हैं, जो महिलाएं हैं, जो फीमेल जर्नलिस्ट हैं, आप लोग भी इत्तेफाक रखती होंगी, वो लकी हैं, मैं मानती हूँ, क्योंकि हर मायने में उनको एक प्रिविलेज मिलता है, एज मिलता है हर बात में। उनकी जो सर्विस, जो सिक्योरिटीज हैं, उनको जो सैलरी मिलती है, उनकी जो बाकी चीजों पर जो ध्यान दिया जाता है, जो न्यूज रूम का माहौल होता है, वैसा, सॉरी मैं कहना चाहती हूँ, हिंदी न्यूज रूम का माहौल वैसा नहीं होता। अखबारों में तो, प्रिंट मीडिया में मैं जिस समय आई, सबसे पहले मुझे पता है, स्मिता जी और विनीता जी, मंदिरा जी, सब लोग इससे इत्तेफाक रखेंगी, जो पहली बीट मुझे दी गई कि आप एजुकेशन कवर कीजिए, दिल्ली यूनिवर्सिटी चले जाइए, जो फ्रेशर के तौर पर जो 21 साल पहले मैंने काम शुरू किया एक अखबार से, और उसके बाद महिला आयोग कवर कर लीजिए, WCD कवर कर लीजिए। यही घूम फिर के मुझे इसी तरह की बीट दी जाने लगी। ठीक है, मैंने उसमें कहा कि अब आप वहां पे न्यूज रूम में, आप मतलब जो आपको असाइन कर दिया जाता है, आपको वो करना है। डिस्क्रिमिनेशन तो इतना ज्यादा था कि आपकी स्टोरी नहीं छपती, बायलाइन नहीं छपती, और घूम फिर के हमें सिर्फ महिलाओं पर ही स्टोरी करने के लिए दिया जाता था। मेरा मानना है कि महिलाएं ठीक है करें, लेकिन ये काम, ये बीट आप पुरुषों को क्यों नहीं देते? क्या उनको सेंसिटिव बनाने की जरूरत नहीं है? हम महिलाएं ही सिर्फ इस पर बात करती रहे कि हमारी सिक्योरिटी के लिए क्या जरूरी है, आप बसों में कैसे सुरक्षा रखें, आप रात में कैसे सुरक्षा रखें। इस बात की परवाह सिर्फ महिलाओं को क्यों हो? पुरुष क्यों नहीं काम करे? एडिटोरियल में इस पर क्यों नहीं डिसीजन होता कि WCD किसी एक मेल जर्नलिस्ट को दीजिए? वो बात करें ना कि विमेन के लिए क्या पॉलिसी है, वो भी तो देखें कि क्या हम कहाँ लैग कर रहे हैं, हमारे सिक्योरिटी के लिए, हमारे सेफ्टी के लिए, हमारे बढ़िया लाइफस्टाइल के लिए, हम गांव की महिलाओं के लिए, सबके लिए क्या पॉलिसी बनाए सरकार, किस तरह से काम करे कि हर महिला सुरक्षित हो, आत्मनिर्भर हो, अपने पैरों पे खड़ी हो। ये काम सिर्फ हम महिला पत्रकारों का है, सॉरी मतलब, लेकिन हमें ऐसा ही करना पड़ा। लेकिन धीरे 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 मैं कहूंगी कि अपने उस बीट पर भी इतना काम किया, ऐसी स्टोरीज की निकाल के लाई कि काबिलियत के बल पर धीरे धीरे, जैसा विनीता जी ने शुरू में कहा कि स्पोर्ट्स बीट दी गई थी उनको। मैं उस समय स्पोर्ट बीट कवर करना महिलाओं के लिए, मैं मानती हूँ, इतना चैलेंजिंग था। हमें तो पॉलिटिकल बीट नहीं दी जाती थी, हिंदी में। फिर भी मैंने बहुत अपनी एक योग्यता साबित की और जो है पॉलिटिकल बीट भी मैंने 10 साल तक कवर किया। लेकिन मुझे ये लगता है कि अभी भी स्मिता जी, विनीता जी, सब लोग, मैं अभी भी इंडिपेंडेंट जर्नलिस्ट के तौर पर काम कर रही हूँ। मुझे हैरानी होती है कि मुझे नौकरी इसलिए नहीं मिलती है कि लोगों को मेरी काबिलियत पर जरा सा भी डाउट नहीं है। उनको पता है कि यदि इसको मौका दे दिया, यदि इसको स्टोरी करने भेज दिया तो कुछ निकाल के लाएगी। और ऐसा मैं ही नहीं, हजारों ऐसी टैलेंटेड लड़कियां हैं, ऐसी महिलाएं काम कर रही हैं जिनको मौका नहीं मिलता। हिंदी मीडिया खास तौर पर उसको इस पर ध्यान देने की जरूरत है। मैं मानती हूँ कि अंग्रेजी मीडिया फिर भी बहुत महिलाओं को मौके देता है, आपको स्पेस देता है। भाईलाइन आपकी पब्लिश होती है, आप किसी दिन, कल भी आप हिंदी के 4 अखबार उठा के देख लीजिए, मैं कहूंगी इंग्लिश में इंक्लूड कर लीजिए, देखिए कि टॉप में कितनी महिलाओं की स्टोरी, कितनी बाइलाइन जो है फीमेल जर्नलिस्ट की बाइलाइन छपी है, या उनकी स्टोरी को कितना स्पेस मिलता है। हम स्पेस के लिए रोज मार करते थे, हमें इतना स्पेस मिलता था, बाइलाइन भी उसमें कट के मिलती थी। उनको लगता था हमारी स्टोरी का कोई मतलब नहीं है। इवन जब मैं पॉलिटिकल बीट कवर कर रही थी, जो बड़ी पार्टी थी उस समय मैं कवर कर रही थी, उसमें भी यदि मैं कोई स्टोरी लाऊं तो जनरली जो डेस्क पे लोग होते थे, सीनियर लोग या जो बॉस होते थे, उनको भरोसा नहीं लगता था। अच्छा, सच कह रही है प्रतिभा, ये पक्का ना, सोर्स कंफर्म है ना, देख लिया ना, चेक कर लो ठीक से। उनको लगता नहीं था कि मैं भी स्टोरी निकाल के, मैं भी पॉलिटिकल बीट पे स्टोरी पे काम कर सकती हूँ। वो 4 बार क्रॉस चेक करते, वो फिर दूसरे सोर्सेज से नेताओं को फोन करते कि क्या ऐसा है क्या। तो ये इतना आप अविश्वास क्यों करते हैं हम पर?
Yes.
आप हमें मौके क्यों नहीं देते हैं? कि बहुत सारी ऐसी बातें हैं जो बताऊं कि इतना भेदभाव सहा है स्मिता जी। अब मैं बताऊं, मेरी बेटी 1.5-2 साल की थी जब मैं शाम में, जैसा आप जानती है रिपोर्टिंग में काम देर तक काम करना पड़ता है, तो मेल कलीग थे कुछ, वो सज्जन अक्सर शाम में मुझे कमेंट करते थे, क्या प्रतिभा अभी ऑफिस में बैठी हो, तुम्हारी बेटी पता नहीं क्या कर रही होगी, बताओ उसके खेलने का समय और तुम ऑफिस में बैठी हो। इतने तरह से आपको वो डिमोरलाइज करते, आपको डिस्करेज करते, कि ताकि मुझे गिल्ट फील कराते कि मैं एक मदर होके मैं शाम में ऑफिस में स्टोरी लिख रही हूँ। वो मुझे गिल्ट फील कराते, कई बार अक्सर मेल क्लिक बात करते। तो फिर मैंने एक दिन जवाब दिया उनको कि मेरी बेटी है, उसको कैसे देखना है ये चिंता मैं कर लूंगी, आप प्लीज चिंता ना किया करें। हर शाम में आपको मेरी बेटी की चिंता हो जाती है। तो ये क्या था? ये इसलिए है ताकि मुझे गिल्ट फील कराए कि आपके लिए प्रोफेशन नहीं है, आप मत आओ इसमें। इस तरह की बहुत सारी दिक्कतें हैं।
Sure. You know, and thank you कि आपने ये सारी बातें शेयर भी की. I think it resonates with a lot of us who have been through newsrooms. And as I said, because I have worked with Hindi and English newsrooms, I've seen the discriminations that have happened at different levels. You know, the kind of biases, the kind of stigmas, the kind of societal, in fact, biases, this guilt feeling also. Dr. Natasha Kaul, and in fact, you know, I can see a lot of people already starting to ask questions. Dia has posted a question. Before I ask Dr. Kaul to share, I think Hosa Skandari McPherson is very worried with the absence of a male speaker here. Please rest assured, as I said right in the beginning, I am always very skeptical. We don't want to be preaching to the choir. So I think I saw Siddharth Varadarajan also log in. I will be happy to hear his thoughts also going forward, and also for any questions or comments that the male colleagues have in the room. You're in a safe room. Please feel free to voice. Hum aapki awaaz nahi dabane wale hain. So, you know, Dr. Natasha Kaul, you're somebody who has been donning several hats. Now, some of the things that Pratibha said, when you look at the way she said the mindset that if you're a woman journalist initially, they will try and allocate beats of covering women and child development. They will ask you to go and do what has been perceived as a soft beat, health, environment, which frankly speaking in today's day and age has been proved to be way more important beat than any beat possible, be it defense, foreign policy in times of a pandemic. So it's somehow almost like the political setups that we see, where in a cabinet committee of security, even if you have women ministers, they may at best be your rubber stamp faces. Is what's happening out in the newsrooms, gender in journalism, a reflection of our societal and political play out, you know, the arena too? Dr. Kaul, and your thoughts on your journey so far. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay. So thank you so much. It really is a pleasure to be here, and also to hear from, from the other panelists and on their journeys. So I must make make it clear, I'm not a journalist by profession. I'm a feminist and I'm a public intellectual. I do, however, write in the media and, and face some of that, some of that, the sexism and the discriminatory kinds of feedback that people get. However, I have 20 years experience of working with feminist theory and on feminist concerns. So that's what I bring to this. Since you asked us for our personal reflections, I mean, very briefly, throughout, I grew up in my formative years in a single woman-headed household in a very patriarchal society in Delhi. So you can imagine all of that, from inheritance to societal networks to all of that. But also I went to the best college for economics in the country, where the opening of a women's hostel at the time was met with by protests from college boys saying that if you open this hostel for women on campus, how are we supposed to concentrate? This is real. I mean, I was recently telling, a kid at that same college now, and they found it impossible almost to believe, but I remember we've seen that. This is SRCC at the time, and it was the first hostel for undergraduate women on campus. Later, my PhD was in economics and philosophy way back at the turn of the century. As a feminist economist, as a heterodox economist, there was never more than 1 or 2 women in any economics departments that I worked in. So we were always in the margins. And at the time, working on feminist economics and kind of doing this, talking about these issues, and people thought, well, how is that economics? Of course, that's not the view. In 20 years, a lot has shifted, but there's that. Then, of course, as somebody who has been speaking up, like many other people, against the Modi-led BJP regime, against the kind of rising conservatism and brutalization and suppression of dissent in Indian society, to be labeled a prostitute, for those of you who don't know, and I'm sure many do, but in case 1 or 2 people don't know, prostitute is the kind of insult leveled against women who are speaking up in the public media. So it's meant to be like a derivation from prostitute. So there's that. And then, of course, as a Kashmiri, as a novelist, as a public intellectual, as an academic who speaks outside of academia, there's a litany of sexual, misogynist, derogation of every kind that you get online and offline all the time, because you are speaking up against right-wing regimes. So there's a whole lot of kind of history there. But what I want to talk about beyond my, just sharing these personal reflections is something to do with the way in which I think that, that gender and journalism cannot be thought of separate from the political, social, cultural misogyny, the everyday sexism, and the patriarchy. You can't just address this. I mean, it is important to, of course, talk about it within specific professions, but it's not just about any one profession, because power and gender, the way in which that works, the way in which that determines whose voice or evidence is seen as valuable, as Pratibha just pointed out, whose concerns are taken seriously, who's rewarded how, who's visible how, is all connected to the ways in which gender and power are structured in patriarchy. So speaking of this is important because, one, India, as you know, in terms of press freedom, the rankings keep sliding down. It's currently, I think, 142 in the most recent one. And secondly, because male fragility is very real, as we can see even from the comments we faced, even in the comment box just now, that there is the way in which there, for many people who do not share a marginalized identity, whether that be gender or caste or whatever, there is a sanctioned ignorance. There is what Spivak calls sanctioned ignorance. The idea that I don't know about it, it's okay for me not to know because it doesn't affect me. And that sanctioned ignorance is what needs to be challenged. So for men who have not, speaking here about gender, for men or others who have not faced these kinds of discriminations and devaluations, they can afford to remain ignorant about it because, that's societally sanctioned for them. It doesn't affect them. And that is what we need to challenge. So I was just looking, to those of you who think, well, how can women talk about this? I mean, I was just looking at this book. It's called the Women's Atlas. It's just like a data from around the world, Joni Seeger, a kind of mapping of data on gender and women's entry into professions, women's access to things around the globe. And actually, the striking conclusion is that there is no developed country in the world if seen from the point of view of gender. Because in every country, everywhere, there is, from a gender point of view, there are a litany of discriminations and, and restrictions that women face. So these discriminations in the Indian context, they include everything from female journalists or people working in the media, facing double day, they have to work in what they're doing, as well as take into account everything else, the care work, the social responsibility that they're often kind of given to a range from that to the whole women and property rhetoric, where women are the possession of men, or, the protection of women is the responsibility of men, or there is, of course, explicit violence against women. I mean, we live in, I keep forgetting, it's spring here and my head's just so much been in India. I keep forgetting I'm saying we live in a country. You live in a country. I kind of mentally live there too. But there's a country where the prime minister of the country, in an election says that Didi oh Didi in that manner about the chief minister, Mamata Banerjee. I mean, it's impossible not to see the connections between the ways in which this very conservative and kind of socially regressive Hindutva idea of women and property and their rhetoric of, delegitimizing dissent as urban Naxal, tukre gang, pseudo-secular, etc., or prostitutes or whatever, how that is connected to the ways in which it emboldens people, their followers, to actually attack women when they speak up, to attack women when they raise these concerns. So, and I would like to especially remember people like Gauri Lankesh. I wanted to, Gauri Lankesh, for those of you who don't know, was a regional language journalist in India who was assassinated. She was, shot by right-wing extremists because of her views. And Gauri Lankesh is in the same, league globally. People like Sabine Mahmood, people like Anna Politkovskaya. There's women who have been speaking up in the public sphere, and that threatens these regressive kind of power configurations. And sometimes they just go and assassinate these women. It's not just a this thing of a rural background. If someone's, not caste privileged in that very casteist society, if someone is Muslim or if someone is Kashmiri or all of those things matter. Firstly, it also matters whether somebody has an institution, is part of an institutional network, or is even more vulnerable because they're working as an independent person. And I think it's, so what we have to, just to kind of wrap up very quickly, I think it matters that there need to be more women in journalism. But that's not just about, just about the kind of more well-known faces. It's great and incredible that women are doing these things, the ones that we recognize. But it's not just that every woman, to be even remotely equal would mean women don't have to be super geniuses, super women, just to be doing the same sort of job that an ordinary guy does without having to be all of that. It's like you don't have to be all that. You should just be able to do the same sorts of things. So one, it's about having more women in journalism, which means also mentoring more women and having support networks. But secondly, it's also about having more women's perspectives, which is a kind of more standpoint approach. That it's also about what does the world look like from that point of view. Right. And that is important. And thirdly, to change this whole question of, what counts as women's issues? Why is that a women's issue? Why is something, why is something seen gendered in that way? So the changes that need to be, that we constantly need to speak about are, individual and institutional, but they're also, I emphasize, ideological. It's right. Not, none of this is new, but the, 2014, post-2014 India is not a kind of new, but it's it's a whole new level of acceleration in this kind of regressive, norms and thoughts around gender.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kaul. And I think that's something that has also spilled over so much from the offline to the online, and the kind of intimidation that we now see on a daily basis. I mean, it's there for men, but when it comes to women in journalism, as Diya Chakravarti has asked, do you think women in media journalism experience microaggressions slightly more than women in other industries? I personally do feel that it is the case, because the industry by itself is one that is of a cutthroat nature, which is very, very demanding. And it's if you look at the various mediums in which the industry operates, these work like machines, these work like beasts. So let me just ask a few specific questions to the panelists, and then Siddharth, if you could also chip in with some thoughts on the subject and more questions. Aishwarya Gatani has a specific question. I'll come to that. But when it comes to Mandira, Vinita, I'll come to you as well.
I just have to interrupt you. Smita, maybe you can also allow some of the male members who have joined to speak up their mind, what they have to say, so that they feel comfortable. It's not all
absolutely. I'll do that. But as Natasha said, that some of the fragility needs to go. So Mandira, the gender perspective that Natasha spoke about, I mean, do you think that it makes a difference? A same topic which is being covered by a male journalist or a female journalist, does the gender perspective really change when it comes to covering the same story?
It depends. I mean, I think that, let me speak for it personally. I think that gender, and for my generation, was something that we didn't really want to include in our stories, if you know what I mean. I mean, I think that there was a fight to sort of be as much, have a voice. It doesn't matter whether it's gender. As a woman journalist.
मैं नहीं उतरूंगी, आपको पहले मुझे घर छोड़ना पड़ेगा। जबकि मुझे लगता है कि वो मैनेजमेंट को ये बात नहीं पता थी। मैं ऑफिस जो है, उनका जो ऑर्गेनाइजेशन है, मुझे लगता है इस बात को इनकरेज नहीं करता होगा। लेकिन अभी एक जो मेंटालिटी है, अभी हम आप ही तो काम कर रहे हैं, वहां इंसान ही तो काम कर रहे हैं। जो एक पैट्रियोटिकल जो सोसाइटी है, हमारी जो माइंडसेट है, वो नहीं निकलता। उनको लग रहा था कि मैं इसके लिए क्यों अपना 10 मिनट में खराब करूंगा। लेकिन मुझे लग रहा था कि आप ड्राइवर के साथ मुझे छोड़ रहे हो, आपको ये खुद भी समझ होनी चाहिए कि 10 मैं इनको पहले ही घर छोड़ देता हूँ, फिर आप घर चले जाएंगे। लेकिन ऐसा नहीं है। सॉरी, मुझे लगता है, मैं ऐसा नहीं कह रही कि दुनिया के सारे मर्द खराब हैं या सारे मेल जर्नलिस्ट खराब है, ऐसा नहीं है। बहुत कॉपरेशन भी मिला, बहुत जो ऐसे मेल कलीग थे, साथी थे, उनसे बहुत सहयोग भी मिला। कई बार घर भी छोड़ा उन लोगों ने, और कई बॉस ऐसे मिले जिन्होंने बहुत मौके दिए काम करने के। मैं सबके लिए बहुत थैंक यू बुक करती हूँ उनको। लेकिन मुझे लगता है कि मी टू मूवमेंट के बाद जितना चेंजेस लाना चाहिए था ऑर्गेनाइजेशन को, जितना अभी भी क्या हिम्मत नहीं कर पाते हैं हम में से। मुझे नहीं लगता कि वो बहुत साहसी महिलाएं हैं, प्रिया रमानी जैसी बहुत कम महिलाएं हैं जो आवाज उठा सकती हैं। मुझे लगता है कि हम यदि ऐसी आवाज उठाएं तो हमें काम मिलेगा, कहीं नहीं मिलेगा। सबसे पहले वही ऑर्गेनाइजेशन कहेगा, नहीं, इनको बिल्कुल इस हमारी बिल्डिंग के आसपास ही मत भटकने देना इनको, क्योंकि ये आवाज उठाने वाली महिलाएं हैं। एक तो जर्नलिस्ट है। एक जो बात हमेशा सुनती थी स्मिता जी, विनीता जी, मतलब खास तौर पर, कि जो कई बार साथियों का, मेल कलीग का भी और फील्ड में भी, इन महिला पत्रकारों का ना दिमाग बहुत खराब हो जाता है। इनको ना बहुत ज्यादा लिखने लगती है, पढ़ने लगती है, इनका दिमाग खराब होता है, क्योंकि ये अधिकार जानती हैं, ये बोलना जानती हैं, ये लिख सकती हैं, ये आवाज उठा सकती हैं। इसलिए इनको थोड़ा दूर रखो। इसलिए मुझे लगता है कि ज्यादातर लीडिंग पोजीशन में भी महिलाओं को मौके इसलिए नहीं मिलते हैं क्योंकि उनको लगता है कि यदि इनको मौका दिया, यदि इनको फैसले लेने के लिए इनको बोर्ड रूम में बिठा दिया, तो ये कुछ ऐसा फैसला करेंगी जो शायद कई मर्दों को नागवार गुजरेगा। इसलिए उनको मैनेजमेंट भी उनको कहता है दूर रखो। ठीक है, रिपोर्टिंग में रख दो इनको, सिटी रिपोर्टिंग में रख लो, ब्यूरो में रख लो, ब्यूरो चीफ ना बनाओ। मैं जानती हूँ कि हिंदी में, विनीता जी आप भी जानती हैं, अभी हाल में ही उषा श्रीवास्तव जी का निधन हो गया। तो पायनियर में लंबे समय तक वो हिंदी में एकमात्र ब्यूरो चीफ थी जो मुझे लगा कि जो लीड कर रही थी। तो कितनी महिलाओं को आप मौका दे रहे हैं लीड करने के लिए, कितनी महिलाओं को उनके लिए उनकी तरह से आप इंतजाम कर रहे हैं कि नहीं, महिलाएं सेफ घर पहुंचे। 9 बजे के बाद 9 बजे आपको जाना है तो आपके अपने दम पर जाओ, आपके पास गाड़ी है या कुछ है, वो आ जाओ ना, ऑर्गेनाइजेशन को मतलब नहीं है। तो मुझे नहीं लगता कि मी टू मूवमेंट के बाद बहुत मीडिया ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस ने अपने में कुछ चेंजेस लाए हो विमेन के लिए, विमेन को थोड़ा सा उनको कंफर्टेबल करने के लिए, मोर विमेन जर्नलिस्ट आए, उनको इनकरेज करने के लिए। मुझे लगता है कि बहुत कम काम हुआ है।
Okay. But I think there's also a dilemma there for a lot of young women journalists who also feel shy of standing up to ask for their rights for security, because then they think that maybe, I'll get labeled. If you want to be treated as an equal in the newsroom, then don't try and talk about these issues. That's another issue. And I don't know, Rahul, how much time do we have for the discussion? Astha, do we have another 15 minutes or so? Astha? Okay, so I'll just take a comment from Dr. Kaul, and then, I'll request Siddharth to chip in some thoughts. Dr. Kaul, in terms of, you spoke about how, as somebody who's vocal, and the different identities, the sub-identities, everything comes into play and gets aggravated in the different shades of violence and intimidation that a person, a woman journalist, a woman in the public life is facing here. Has it led to a lot of self-censoring, would you think? Would you think that the kind of situation that we see today, perhaps a lot of women are forced now, especially the ones who are in media, when you write your own articles, are there times when you actually type it out, delete it, type it out, delete it, think thrice before hitting on the publish button?
Speaking for myself, I don't, but I think there are layers of protection. I mean, I'm not physically there. I'm in 2019 on the eve of the thing in Kashmir, the constitutional coup. I left on the eve, so I don't know how things will be if I were to return. But I haven't been able to, and partly also because of the pandemic. I think that whether, if you're asking me more generally as as an observer, what I would say is, do people self-censor? Yes, of course they do, and sometimes it's the rational thing for people to do, because their safety may depend on it, their livelihood may depend on it, and at the same time,
sorry, just add, because the point of asking this question is, for women, even for men who are getting intimidated online, for women it gets complicated when you have rape threats and death threats coming your way, of people wanting to shame you in public.
Yes, and I want to say that some of this is just is a longer term structural thing. It's going back again. I mean, I could give you any number of instances, but going back, SRCC, President of Economic Society elections. I'm the only woman standing for the candidature. I get rape threats on the phone. I mean, this is like 1990 something. It's a college election. This is something so endemic and so normalized in Indian society. It's at every kind of, if there's a woman who has, and I've written about this on elderly single women and property, if there's a woman and you want her to vacate the house, you'll either make character assassinations, people will do that. They label her a witch or something, all of that. It's just so normalized, so banalized in Indian society. So there's that. I mean, there's this kind of longer term thing. But I think what's happened since, and I keep linking this up with politics because the gender and power link up that way, is that since 2014, it's just become, there's been like this additional level of validation that has come from the regime that makes it be okay for people, when there are people who use the word prostitutes who are part of the governance structures, then that becomes normalized. When those kinds of accounts are followed by people in positions of power, then that are giving out these rape and that threats, a catalog of these horrible insults, and for women, these are violent, graphic, sexualized, misogynist kind of insults, and that's not something that men have to face in the same way. Now, obviously, addressing that whole point that some people raised earlier, it's not, of course, not all men do this. Of course, not all men even agree with this, and to an extent, patriarchy relies on the silence of good men. And so, therefore, more men should speak up about it. And when they do, it's great that, that is how it should be. Because women should not be judged, differently than men because of how they wear. Their safety should not be ideally an additional concern when they go out and report or when they speak up. But it's like with every other kind of, marginalized identity. Your actions get interpreted as being about who you are, not about what you are saying or doing. It's like if the same guy does it, if there's a lone shooter, and if that's a white shooter, then that person's just kind of, is just kind of upset or something. But if that person happens to be black or brown or Muslim or something, then it's wider. So it's the same with, you know, with any kind of marginalized identity, in that the amount of weight that is given to how your actions get interpreted, as well as how you yourself are able to make your choices in what you do and how you get perceived. There's much lesser control of that, you know, of the individual upon how they get perceived. And this is the, you know, this is the essentially, so for men who are here, you know, and earlier who were asking that question, really questions about gender or, you know, a feminist perspective, and there isn't just one, but I think it's possible to agree that essentially it comes to the point about structures matter. If you think that structures matter, then you would not have an objection to being able to see how something is not just a one-off. It's not, you know, it's a structural thing, and therefore it needs to also be structurally addressed. And women, and in public sphere, again, I think the other panelists raised this point, you know, women reading, women speaking up, women being closer to, you know, the way in which knowledge is constructed in society have always been a threat. This is a, you know, it goes back to from witch burning to women being, you know, seen as pathologized because they were reading or writing books. This is a much older thing. Gender is, you know, so men are seen as the unmarked norm, and women are seen as the different ones. The idea is that we want to constantly be fighting, even if we lose these battles, for a context where it will be possible for women to be perceived, to have the same degrees of freedom, to have the same, you know, ability to be interpreted as men. And that, in order for that to happen, women have to be not be the same as men, which unfortunately they have to do if they're a minority in some profession, in politics, media, whatever, but for them to be seen equally kind of valid in their own existence as different, but not unequal. And that's really hard because, you know, because gender is so much more than just women or men or all of this. Gender is a relationship of power. It's about how anything which is feminized is a prelude to seeing it as inferior. So if you feminize something, a sexuality, an identity, an ethnicity, a person, anyone, the very position of, you know, of the feminine is seen as this other, and therefore, you know, capable of being kind of either protected or oppressed or whatever. So, you know, so that connotation of the feminine, that semiotic kind of weight that comes with the assignation as feminine, is part of what we have to struggle to revalue as not being inferior. That it's not about masculine, feminine doesn't mean the same as, you know, kind of less valid,
right,
in that binary.
Okay. I see a lot of comments, in fact, popping up here on the chat box. There's an interesting parallel conversation going on. Hosa continues to talk about women's discrimination around the world. Anirudh Banerjee, in fact, is talking about learning from the Scandinavian countries, you know, identifying that gender is a mental construct. And also Siddharth Jha has joined in. Let me get in fact, Siddharth Varadarajan here. Siddharth, who's the founder of Wire. Siddharth, if you could come in and just give us a sense, because, you know, there's a question here that Nikita is asking. The given leadership and decision-making disparity that exists, how much autonomy women exercise with respect to covering a particular issue? There's also another question that I wanted to take. Yeah, from Anirudh again, that women journalists have been incredibly successful as war correspondents, but when it comes to administrative matters of broadcasting or publishing, they have been kept out. Is it because the news has to be from a male gaze, presented by women only as a medium? Siddharth, would you like to share some thoughts here before I go back to panelists with some specific questions that have been asked? And if any of the, in fact, you know, other members who are attending want to speak up, please switch on your video and raise your hand so that you can also add your comments here. Siddharth.
Yeah, thanks, Smita. I just actually come to listen to you guys, but I'm happy to offer my 2 cents in response to these questions. I mean, the way I understand it is that the problem that women face in journalism is because they operate within organizational structures that are gendered, and they are covering a society that is gendered and deeply patriarchal, and you are covering government policies, across all beats. But these policies also have a very strong patriarchal element, even if this is not explicitly manifested. But for example, the women who cover, say, the MEA or defense or home ministry beats, and I think it's not a coincidence that, and I'm not saying this to flatter anybody, but the best reporters today who are covering these beats are all happen to be women. Whether there's you, Smita, there's Suhasini, there is Jyoti Malhotra, there's Naz of UNI in her day. I think now she's running her own website, so I don't know how much reporting she gets to do. Devi Rupa and my colleague Devi Rupa, and what distinguishes, and if you look at home ministry, for my money, somebody like Vijayta Singh is pretty much the only reporter who gives us insights into what is happening in that ministry. I'm pretty convinced that the more women you have who are covering this, the more it will be possible for them to break down because covering these ministries is often a struggle against official disinformation.
But Siddharth, let me just interrupt you for a quick point, because I think one of the key questions that people are wanting to ask is that when you have women who are so competent, who are so professional today, who are working doubly hard as their male colleagues, what is it that is stopping their growth when it comes to the leadership positions? From my personal experience today, I know there are way more women on these beats, which earlier used to be the male-dominated beats. But on TV, if you look at across Hindi channels, English news channels, you'll see a lot more women anchors anchoring. But when it comes to decision making, being able to take a call about their shows, being able to lead on editorial content, that really doesn't happen. That is somebody else who's dictating the terms to them from behind. So where do you think is that lacking in the Indian newsrooms?
Yeah. No, that's what I'm saying. So you have individual reporters who are doing a great job, but they're doing so within an organizational structure, right? Which is gendered. And the fact is that even though you have some newspapers that have been edited by women in the past, Malini Parsarthi, Mrinalji edits National Herald, Jayanti of Deccan Herald in the past, Deccan Chronicle, I'm sorry. And there are probably other examples. And you have some women who've headed newsrooms in TV channels, but really they are few and far between. I mean, this is still at the top. The decision making is done by males to a large extent. And there's an added problem, which is that actually editorial decision making is not in the hands of editors in the vast majority of Indian newsrooms. These decisions are in the hands of managers and proprietors, with the possible exception of Shobha Bhartiya, all of whom are male, and all of whom are businessmen who have all kinds of very warped ideas about what journalism is. So there is this structural problem, which is a constant battle that anybody who is serious about journalism has to fight. Women have to fight it doubly hard. And as I said, even if you are able to manage that in your own organization, or even if your own organization is sensitive, you are operating within a news environment, within a political, social environment that is patriarchal. And so constantly you face pressures of one kind or the other. We haven't spoken, I don't know, I joined a little bit late because I couldn't find the link. But online threats is the new form in which women who are competent, women who are outspoken, women whose journalism challenges the establishment get targeted and intimidated. So what used to happen in the form of snickering in the newsroom, or a sexist put down, or even physical harassment, as the Me Too movement has documented, is now that goal of intimidating women is accomplished very easily online through the kind of digital trolling that happens. And this is a new kind of challenge which has to be confronted. So I think that this I think you've done. I think this conversation is essential. I'm not sure that in the absence of concerted government action, courts taking action on this issue of security, particularly online security, any easy. I think news organizations can offer some measure of insulation protection when these issues come up. But I think that this is something which is emerging as a major problem, causes stress in all kinds of ways. I have colleagues who you think would be able to brush aside this kind of daily harassment, but it takes its toll.
It does. It does. It absolutely does. And I think that was something that Dr. Natasha Kaul also was referring to in her comments. So, I'm just going to take some questions from the chat box because we have another 15 minutes to go. And maybe towards the end, Vinita could also share some thoughts in terms of specifically the question that's being asked about what has changed in the newsroom in terms of when it comes to dealing with issues like Me Too. But Mukul Sharma has a question specifically for Mandira Nair. He wants to ask that in contrast to taking orders from a male boss, why is it so difficult for male colleagues in an office to take orders, instructions from a female boss? Mandira, would you like to answer that? That's specifically for you.
Unfortunately, I haven't worked in an organization that has there has been a female boss, so I wouldn't know. So I wouldn't.
You've not had the opportunity of bossing around anybody.
I have not had an opportunity of bossing around. No. Okay. Not as yet. Maybe never. Judging by the glass ceiling there is, but yeah, I wouldn't know.
But, Mandira, coming to the question that we were discussing with Dr. Natasha Kaul, for people who are active online now, and especially in a time where, just being somebody who has a contrarian opinion can call in for so much of hate, can call in for so much of trolling. And then if you're a woman, Firdaus Hamid talks about women journalists from Kashmir. If you're a Muslim woman, if you're a Kashmiri journalist, if you have other identities, sub-identities too. Have you thought about censoring yourself on occasions? Are there days when you thought about really getting angry on a tweet and then just deleted it or saved it as a draft for some other day? Does it affect you?
Well, I do think, I agree, I have. I haven't censored myself because of anger, but I have because I don't think the trolling helps. I mean, I think the thing is that you get really, really angry. And one of the things, and I think that that's very important to also say, one of my professors used to say that if you stop getting angry, you've also ceded a part of yourself. And I think this online vitriol that is headed as sort of directed at women, especially, vocal women, as Siddharth said, at rape threats, I think we've ceded a part of ourselves. We just stopped fighting. I don't know whether that's a good thing or not. I think there is a certain, I'm not saying that I've consciously self-censored, but yes, who wants to be direct, who wants this hatred directed at them? I think every woman has faced it at a different time and a different space. And I think it's the easiest way to sort of damage women or get them to shut up. And it's not new. I mean, Twitter's just given a microphone to every village idiot, but it's not new, as Natasha said, that she faced this when she was in 1990 and she was running for a college election. It's age old.
Right. Dr. Kaul, Pradipta is asking that is it really possible to think of bringing about a change in our newsrooms, in the media space, unless you have a mental revolution at the societal level? And Divya, in fact, wants to ask that while we discuss about women representation and gender in media, what can be the reason for underrepresentation of queer people in journalism, media, other than the glamour quotient? Would you like to address these two questions?
Sorry, could you just repeat the second one?
The underrepresentation of people from the LGBTQI community in the media space.
Yeah. So I would say that if the question is it possible to address this? I'd say it's not possible not to. And it's not possible not to address it for those of us who are affected by it directly or indirectly. For the rest of people who are not directly or indirectly affected by it, it should be possible to see why it is important and to question that, that the sanctioning of that ignorance. So it's a bit like the idea of radical democracy, something that is always on the horizon but never quite achieved. Think of it, for those of you who do maths, think of it as an asymptote. We're always getting there and we've never quite gotten there. So gender, addressing these issues of gender is a bit like that. It needs to be done multidimensionally, as all of the other speakers, panelists, and Siddharth pointed out. It's institutional, it's it's ideological, and at many levels this has to constantly happen. So this is really hard in a context where the government's official response to the case in a court case against, there was this court case about allowing women in combat roles in the army. And the government's, one of their, their actual official kind of reasons given for that, which they eventually lost, was that, well, soldiers would not take orders from women's superiors in combat positions. So that was like officially a thing. Likewise, there are court judgments where effectively some version of marry or rapist kind of judgments are given, where the idea is that the women, there are, chief ministers who talk about women in ripped jeans causing problems. So this is something that isn't just about media, but for that person, I'd say it is really important. Media is a really important domain through which all of this elsewhere can also be addressed. And therefore, having more women and questioning the very idea of how women are treated and what gets seen as women's issues within the media is therefore really important. The question about, different sexual identities. I mean, yes, of course, there are fewer, and the same thing we could say the same thing about, about Muslims or about Dalits or about, about sexual minorities. Because the idea here is, well, there are two things here. One, that having different perspectives is always makes for better knowledge, because you get multi-perspectival objectivity. It's like the old elephant and the blind man's story. You get different perspectives. So what Siddharth was saying, that these women covering these, these roles with these ministries have better reportage because you bring something to it if you're not just from within that norm. So there's that reason why we should have more of these different kinds of identities. Secondly, there should, there is why there are fewer LGBTQ people, just as why there are fewer women has to do with patriarchy and misogyny and sexism. That has to do with homophobia. It has to do with perceptions of who the ideal kind of normative person is, who gives us, and the news, who tells us what to think about. And within that ecosystem, what is the role that women have? And they may just see that role as somebody who dresses a certain way and appears on screen and just delivers as this kind of conduit, rather than the person who is creating the news. So, so it's not, I mean, it's not surprising, the reasons for it, but I think it's also important not to, to one say that you don't have to be exceptionally bright, brilliant, whatever, to be recognized as a woman or gay or Dalit or whatever journalist in the same sorts of roles. And also that we have to also be wary of easy appeal. There's internalized misogyny, there's tokenism, all of that is also very real. So it's also possible for there to be, if you have a woman who actually says, well, I'm not a feminist, I've never faced any discrimination, and there's nothing wrong with this News Corp or whatever, then that doesn't really change the reality. So it's not just about, our biologies, it's also about how we are experiencing that world. And likewise, I mean, for a lot of these things like gender and homosexuality, sexual equality were used as ways of legitimizing what happened in Kashmir at the same time at which you have cases like Asifa, at the same time in Kashmir, or the case like straight case in India. I mean, it's just like.
In fact, there's a question for you, which I will in fact request Yogesh to, maybe he could ask the question himself. But before that, let me just take one comment from Pratibha, and I know Antony also wants to share some thoughts. Pratibha, एक यहाँ पर अनिरुद्ध बैनर्जी पूछ रहे हैं कि मेल डोमिनेंस एक कांस्टेंट रहा है, आप उससे हर रोज रूबरू होती हैं, इत्तेफाक रखती हैं, तो ऐसे में एक औरत अपनी आवाज कैसे ढूंढे, उस आवाज को तवज्जो कैसे दे और उस आवाज को मजबूती से कैसे बनाए रखे? जो वुमेन जर्नलिस्ट आज आ रही हैं, उनको आप क्या कहेंगी कि हाउ डू यू फाइंड योर ओन वॉइस?
मेरा मानना है कि हम अब दूसरों पर, मतलब सारी जिम्मेदारी मीडिया हाउसेस पर डालने के बजाय या अपने मेल क्लिक पे डालने के बजाय थोड़ा सा हम भी अपने आप को देखें, समझें कि क्या हम अपना जो हमें प्लेटफॉर्म मिला है, क्या हम वाकई उसका पूरा इस्तेमाल कर रहे हैं, हम सोसाइटी की बात को सही तरीके से पहुंचा रहे हैं, हम विमेन की वॉइस को सही तरीके से सही प्लेटफॉर्म पर हम रख रहे हैं। हमको देखना चाहिए जो विमेन, जो खासतौर पर अंग्रेजी मीडिया में तो बहुत सारी महिलाएं हैं इस पोजीशन में जो लीड कर रही हैं, काम देख रही हैं, तो देखना चाहिए कि क्या आप अपने साथ जो दूसरी जो विमेन जर्नलिस्ट काम कर रही हैं, आप उनको कितना इनकरेज कर रही हैं। हम यदि 2-3 लोगों को भी, हम पूरा समाज नहीं बदल सकते, पूरी सोसाइटी को हम नहीं बदल सकते, लेकिन यदि हमने ये जिम्मा ले लिया कि चलो जो नई लड़कियां आएंगी, जो नई पीढ़ी आएगी इस जर्नलिज्म में, इस मीडिया में, हम उनका साथ देंगे, हम उनके साथ खड़े रहेंगे, हम उनको इनकरेज करेंगे, तो मुझे लगता है कि हम पूरी दुनिया नहीं बदल सकते, हम 2-3 लोगों की भी हेल्प यदि कर दे, यदि जो हमारे साथ, जो हमारे जो साथ में जो हमारे फीमेल कलीग हैं, यदि हम उनके साथ खड़े रहें, हम उनको मदद करें, हम उनके, तो हम, मुझे लगता है कि हम अपनी आवाज को सही ढंग से उठा सकते हैं। और ऐसा नहीं है कि उठा नहीं रहे, कर रहे हैं, बहुत अच्छा काम कर रही हैं, आप उनको मौके तो दीजिए। आप देख लीजिए महिलाएं कितना बढ़िया काम कर रही हैं, चाहे वॉर में हो, चाहे आप तो एमईए कवर करती हैं स्मिता जी, कितनी महिलाओं को हिंदी में, मुझे नहीं लगता कि हिंदी में किसी महिला को आपने देखा है कि हिंदी मीडिया, हिंदी अखबार से कोई महिला एमईए कवर कर रही हो, मुझे नहीं लगता। मुझे लगता बहुत संख्या इसकी बहुत, हिंदी और अंग्रेजी का एक बहुत बड़ा फर्क है, इसको बहुत मिटाने की जरूरत है, क्योंकि जो हमारा देश हिंदी भाषी प्रदेश है, मतलब बहुत सारे राज्य हैं जहाँ हिंदी अखबार बहुत ज्यादा बिकते हैं, लेकिन उसमें आप महिलाओं को शामिल ही नहीं करेंगे, उनकी आवाज उठाने वाला जब होगा ही नहीं कोई, तो कौन उनकी बात करेगा। जो मैंने बात शुरू में की थी कि हमें विमेन एंड चाइल्ड डेवलपमेंट इश्यूज कवर करने के लिए हमें ही क्यों दिए जाते हैं, आप दो, हमें दो, हम जरूर, हम ही, क्योंकि हम महिला हैं, हम इस इशू को, हम अपने खुद से जुड़े इशू को, दूसरी जो हमारी महिलाएं हैं, हमारे साथ हमारी बिरादरी के जो लोग हैं, उनकी बात हम ज्यादा समझ सकते हैं, क्योंकि दूसरे को भी समझने का मौका दो। इसलिए हमको लगता है कि आप एक चीज देखिए, एक जो जरूरी बात मैं कहना चाहती हूँ कि हिंदी एक बड़ा अखबार जिसकी मालकिन भी महिला है और एक बड़ी महिला संपादक भी वहां रही, आप गौर कीजिए कि क्या आपने वहां उस बोर्ड रूम में या एडिटोरियल में या अपने रिपोर्टिंग में कितनी महिलाओं को मौका दिया। तो ये जिम्मा हम पर भी, हम सिर्फ दूसरों पर दोषारोपण ना करें। यदि हमें लीड करने का मौका मिलता है, यदि हम हमको कहीं बॉस बनने का मौका मिलता है, हमको कहीं अपनी टीम को लीड करने का मौका मिलता है, तो हम तो कोशिश कर लें कि हमारे साथ जो एक ठीक ठाक संख्या तो हमारे साथ हो, तभी हम अपनी आवाज उठा सकते हैं।
आई थिंक ये बदलाव जो है न्यूज रूम्स में आना ज्यादा जरूरी है, ना कि समाज में कब बदलेगा, क्योंकि न्यूज रूम्स अगर ये आवाज उठाएंगे तो समाज में बदलाव।
वही मैं कह रही हूँ, हम पूरी सोसाइटी नहीं बदल सकते, लेकिन छोटे छोटे स्टेप्स उठा के हम बहुत सारी बदलाव ला सकते हैं, जिससे नई युवा यंग जनरेशन को इंकरेजमेंट होगा कि नहीं, मीडिया का फील्ड, जैसा विनीता जी ने कहा ना कि नहीं, मीडिया का फील्ड इतना बुरा नहीं है, बुरा आपने उसको बना दिया है, हम तो कोशिश करें उसको ठीक करने की।
बुरा नहीं है, जो लोग आना चाहें बिल्कुल, बी पैशनेट अबाउट जर्नलिज्म, इट्स स्टिल अ profession that's absolutely close to my heart. I'm just going to take very brief final comments now. Anthony, I believe you wanted to come in and share some thoughts here. Please go ahead. You could unmute yourself.
Good. Can you see me now?
You've switched off your video. Yes, I can see you now. Please go ahead.
I think the central fight against women's oppression is absolutely essential in the last 8 years. It's in a big struggle in Britain around Clapham Commons, caused a mass movement against undemocratic rights, because you got some of the very dictatorial regime like Modi. I think what we got to link up with the farmers and the workers to fight for a different society, to get rid of capitalism. But unless capitalism goes, the degeneration and decay will carry on. But I think there's a possibility of a socialist revolution in India in the next year or two. I mean, what happened in Kerala was interesting. Kerala, but the Maoists did very well. Maybe a sign of this, I don't know, the Trotsky's myself. But the Pun Revolution might be carried out on that. And you should read the American Socialist Workers, they're very bad now. But in the 60s, they did about the importance of women and fighting for black liberation. Read Trotsky's writing on the black question, why that is key to the socialist revolution. And they worked out the same question on women. They called it the combined revolution. Intersectionality, is that what that means? Reads of it. I put out 4 blogs. If you try my name, Anthony Brain Trotskyism, I've been writing for 14 years, and I write about intersectionality in the George Floyd protest and the Syria Abdul protest. I've known Natasha 4 years at the anti-Trump protest. That's why I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you so much, Anthony. Of course, there are larger questions, and which I'm sure Raisina House would love to host another discussion on. But Yogesh Negi, would you like to ask the question that you've posted for Dr. Natasha Kaul, and then I'll come to Mandira for her concluding thoughts as well. Yogesh, would you like to switch on your camera and ask the question? Is Yogesh there in the room? Okay, so I don't see him. Dr. Natasha, essentially what Yogesh is asking is, as we see journalists in Kashmir witness absolutely different level of repression and threat from the government, police and apparatus, and they do not get enough space to bring up the absolutely tragic stories. So how can the stories of Kashmiri women be brought in mainstream society when journalists are under the direct control of the state? Some brief comments. Unmute yourself, Natasha.
Yeah, so on Kashmir, there's a big kind of long-running situation of almost always there has been a state-centric media coverage. So what people in India get to hear about Kashmir has been systematically filtered through the prism of the state's interests. Now, some ways in which this might have been you could go against this was to just compare the sorts of the front page of newspapers in an Indian or a Kashmiri newspaper on the same day, and you would see how different the realities are in the two places. But even that is being limited now because there is now much more direct censorship on Kashmiri journalists, and that can include filing of cases under vague definitions of UAPA or something on them so as to limit them, but also just constant harassment. So for well-known journalists to constantly just being asked to come to the police station, to indirect threats being given to them that with the idea that they would a signal of fear and to censor them. So that is obviously a very real and urgent thing. It affects men and women and everyone individually as Kashmiris and as a society. And I think that that's why, as people who are in journalism, it calls for much greater solidarities between people who are based in India and journalists who are based in Kashmir in terms of trying to understand. And these bridges are really hard to build. I mean, I speak as somebody who's not a Kashmiri Muslim and who speaks about the rights of Kashmiris, and for that, have faced any amount of kind of most extreme threats to me, connected to me. So this is it's part of kind of a wider when it comes to Kashmir, I think it's a constant process of unlearning and thinking, and going beyond one's comfort zones when it comes to people, to even media people in India, because even the kind of the critical media journalists in India may still not be able to take off the blinkers of nationalism, violent nationalism when it comes to Kashmir, and therefore that is important. If you would like me just to add one or two more things as my closing remarks, or do you want to come back to me?
Sure, Doctor. Just go ahead and complete.
So yeah, so I think that in response to that question about what should, and Pratibha and others pointed out, what should it? Yeah, so there's like this bigger kind of macro thing, and then there's also very micro things and meso things that can happen, and some of that in the media context, I would say, would be things like mandating discussions on such issues. Getting people to think critically, doing gender audits, getting an all-women panel to think about these things, getting people to talk, to create those spaces, so that people ask. There's this very famous Chilean rape anthem that you might have come across online. It's a protest anthem, and some of the lines are like, the judges, the cops, your police, they're all men. So a very simple kind of thought exercise is for guys to just actually think, close their eyes and think. If all of the roles in power and around you in media and everywhere, if you just reverse that and thought that all the ones that are men right now were women and vice versa, how would you feel in that world? Because that is essentially how women feel, and therefore that is those sorts of kind of thinking otherwise exercises are really important. And this is not it's not a, they come back and they say, well, this is anti-national, you're just kind of trying to talk these issues because talk about these issues because you're liberals or anti. This is a global thing. I mean, Anthony just mentioned, I don't know him personally, but but I know people online, and this is an Clapham Common here, the police, they kind of really misogynist handling of protests, and this was just last month, just a few weeks ago. And a policeman, being involved in the rape and murder of a girl. So these are global things. Jo Cox, who was a British MP at the time of Brexit, was murdered here. These are, this doesn't go against hurting the image of India. It's not a liberal plot to kind of destroy Indian image, as the right wing would tell you. Talking about gender is not that. It's really important. And I think also at school level, when kids study civics and things like subjects like that, I think gender studies as some element of curriculum needs to be so important. Is so important and needs to be part of that, because we are witnessing the effects of that in a world where you have these misogynist authoritarians globally. I mean, just imagine if people like Trump, Modi, Bolsonaro, Boris Johnson, Putin, and Xi Jinping were women, and they had created this much chaos in the world. I mean, men would be up in arms about trying to change it. Just imagine that. So, this is what we
that's quite a thought, of course, to think about through the evening after this conversation. But just the last couple of minutes, Mandira, if you're still there, I would like to ask you, both you and Vinita could also come in with the concluding remarks. Pradipta Jha is asking, what are the major domains or elements that need an instant change, or should I say an awakening, that would bring fundamental and substantial changes in the fields where gender sensitivity issues exist? Priyanka, if you have your camera switched on, you can ask the question briefly. You wanted to ask something.
Hello.
Yes.
Am I audible, ma'am?
Yes.
First of all, thank you so much for such a enlightening discussion that was much needed today, at this time especially. It's not a sort of question, but I can say it's sort of extension to your discussion. And, especially, I'm posing this extension to Nitasha Koul, ma'am. Ma'am, as you have mentioned a lot, you have not, it's for us, it's nowhere untouched, any area related to patriarchy. You have talked about misogyny, power politics, patriarchy, and everything that was required. But if I say, as far as India is concerned, if we say that we're talking about gender issues, how far is it appropriate to call, if I say that the life of human being varies with their respective position, with their position in the caste hierarchy? Because we are talking about gender issues in a general sense. We are relating it with the power politics and sort of also with the patriarchy. So both these are interrelated too. But how far it is, am I right if I say that in India, the life of human being, whether it's male, female, LGBT issue, it varies with their position in terms of caste hierarchy.
Priyanka, I think I'll have to stop you there, but thanks for coming in, because that's something also Dr. Nitasha Kaul had spoken about, the identities and the subalterns, and also whether you are a Dalit, whether you are, you belong to an upper caste, lower caste, whether you belong to, whether you're a Hindu, Muslim, all these identities add up to the complications. I'm just going to ask Mandira to come in on the question about what do you think as concluding remarks, Mandira, should be some form of changes that you need, and then Pratibha and Vinita for your last comments, please.
Well, I think one of the aspects, and I think people have said this in the room, is that while we, are we preaching really to the choir? So I think there's an important need
your
to bring
video
in men.
switched off, Mandira. Sorry,
I think there's an important need to bring in men in the conversation. So I think there is an important need to sort of, as Nitasha said, to have a question, to bring it in, to talk about gender in school. So I think that was important. I think giving women leadership positions immediately. I mean, I think there should be women who've been competent. I think there should be women in leadership position. I also would like to flag an aspect of, while it's important to talk about the gender imbalance of journalism, I think journalism is only part of society, and I think we've been saying that a lot. Okay, so while what women journalists go through is visible, and we're sort of vocal about what we're going through, I think it's important to remember that we are not existing in a vacuum, and I think it's also important to just flag off, while I don't think it's the immediate thing, is to look at how the pandemic is going to affect women journalists. I think we're feeling the effects of it much more. Work at home, women are also at the front line going out to hospitals. They're vulnerable. They're also looking after primary caregivers at home. Yes. Whether it is this thing, I don't think we've talked about those challenges and how organizations look at women immediately as they become mothers or get married. I think that's an institutional problem that exists across sectors, but especially in journalism, where we are sort of, where it's a 24/7 job. I think those are aspects we haven't really addressed, and I would really like to put that out. I think it's important for organizations to support. I think there needs to be more women's solidarity. I think IWPC is important to do that. I think it's important to do it. So I think that is it. I think there should be more conversations about gender and sensitivity with men. I think there was a start with Me Too. It hasn't helped enough. I think there needs to be more frank discussion. I think everyday sexism needs to go. I think it's important to do that. I think women need to be put in leadership positions for competent, not as a dole out, but because they're competent. Yes. I think there needs to be organizational support for women across, especially because of the pandemic. And I think that are aspects. I think women are taking the brunt of it. Women are falling off, and women journalists are just going to be. It's going to be us next, especially yes. with the kind of media environment there is. So Absolutely. I think when we talk about self-censorship, we're also self-censoring ourselves because we don't want to be out of a job. I think there's a multiple dimension only apart from misogyny and apart from the hate that we face is also that. I think those are also important aspects to address.
And I'm glad that you flagged them here at the end of the conversation, because I think the financial challenges too, the pandemic has had a crippling effect on our lives. It has devastated lives and livelihoods, and more so for women, who have been the worst ones to bear the brunt in terms of being thrown out of the workforce. So similarly, things have happened within the newsrooms too. Pratibha, very briefly, you wanted to come in on Priyanka, and then I'll go to Vinita for the concluding remarks.
Sorry, can I also say that while that is, this whole thing was also about freedom of expression, and I think that women journalists have actually been at the heart of leading and, moving that frontier, whether it's Patricia Mukham, whether it is Anuradha Bhasin, whether it's Priya Ramani. So I mean, I think while we have been a part of this system, we've also fought and we've also made our voices heard. So I think there is enough to be said about them. Mrinal Pandey, okay, probably only woman editor who got there without being an owner.
Yeah, without being an owner, without having a surname. Yeah. So yeah, those are major thumbs up, of course, to the stellar role models. Pratibha, very briefly, and Priyanka Nitasha has also posted something on the chat box, which you may like to take a glimpse of.
निताशा जी और मंदिरा जी ने बहुत सारी बातें बताई हैं जो बहुत जरूरी है कि मीडिया में हम कैसे चेंजेस ला सकते हैं. मैं ब्रीफली 3 चीजों पर मैं फोकस करना चाहती हूँ. मुझे लगता है कि ज्यादा से ज्यादा जो विमेन इंडस्ट्रियलिस्ट हैं उनको आगे आना चाहिए कि मीडिया हाउसेस वो अपना तैयार करें, अखबार निकालें, न्यूज चैनल्स खोलें, ताकि ज्यादा से ज्यादा महिलाओं को मौके वो समझ सकती हैं. उनका एक पर्सपेक्टिव होता है, ज्यादा से ज्यादा महिलाओं को उसमें मौके मिलने चाहिए. दूसरा, मुझे लगता है कि मीडिया हाउसेस को अपने उस हिडन पॉलिसी के बारे में बताना चाहिए कि वो क्या चीज है जो आपको विमेन को आगे लाने से रोकती है, उनको लीडरशिप के रोल में लाने से रोकती है. वो बताएं इस बात को कि क्या हम नहीं ऐसा है जो विमेन जर्नलिस्ट नहीं कर सकती, विमेन एडिटर नहीं कर सकती, सिर्फ मेल एडिटर कर सकते हैं. तीसरी बात, आजकल मीडिया इंस्टीट्यूट्स बहुत सारे खुल गए हैं, उस वजह से बहुत अच्छा लगता है देख के कि यंग जनरेशन बहुत आ रहे हैं. उसमें लड़कियां बहुत आ रही हैं, छोटे छोटे शहरों से लड़कियां आ रही हैं कि वो मीडिया में आना चाहती हैं. लेकिन मैं कई क्लासेस भी लेती हूँ कई मीडिया उसमें इंस्टीट्यूट्स में. जब मैं जाती हूँ वहां तो देखती हूँ कि 50% लड़के लड़कियां सब में वो उनको लगता है कि जो एंकरिंग है एक सिर्फ वही एक जर्नलिज्म है, वही मीडिया है, एक ग्लैमर कि आप चूंकि टीवी पे स्क्रीन पे दिखते हैं. मुझे लगता है कि इस परसेप्शन को भी मिटाने की जरूरत है कि बच्चे सिर्फ मीडिया बहुत बड़ा है, आप कहीं से भी अपनी, आप डिजिटल में जा सकते हैं, आप टीवी में जा सकते हैं, आप अखबार में काम कर सकते हैं, आप मैगजीन में काम कर सकते हैं. आपको अपनी आवाज उठानी चाहिए. तो हमको इससे क्या होता है कि जो कई बार बच्चे आते हैं, नई यंग जनरेशन आता है और जब उनको एंकरिंग का मौका नहीं मिलता तो वो डिस्करेज होकर वापस कई बार लौट जाते हैं. मुझे लगता है इसको भी हमको यंग जनरेशन को इसको बताने की जरूरत है कि क्या चैलेंजेस हैं और आपको किस तरह से इसको फेस करना है.
And that actually is related to the larger issue of journalism, not just specific to gender journalism, because I have also come across several male students who simply want to do journalism because they want to be on camera. But anyways, I think this has been a fascinating conversation, and it's a conversation which we can go on and on because there are lots of issues. Things do not change, transform overnight. But I'm glad that the panelists have been able to point out to some of the stellar role models that we have. We need way more role models today in this industry, especially in terms of the women role models who are also not just in leadership positions, but also willing to mentor and take along with them the others who are coming into the industry. Networks like the Indian Women Press Corps, the network of women, journalists across India. There are several of them working at regional to national levels. We speak a lot about the national mainstream media, but there's so much that's happening across the vernacular press, the regional press, where the issues are even more complicated. So I'm going to leave, conclude this conversation here, and I'll leave it to Vinita to wrap up her thoughts on. Vinita, what do you think today is perhaps the one key thing that has finally changed, and you would ideally want to see the one thing that should change in the next, in the earliest possible time frame?
Thank you, Smita. Thank you so much. I think I would like to see more women in feed, more than seeing them in anchor or in newsroom. I would like to see more women journalists going out aggressively doing stories. I would like to see more bylines, more reportage, because these women are the role models. The moment you see a woman reporter on screen, I think they encourage a lot of their lot. When you see a woman doing a big story, which can be investigative story, we have some very good investigative reporters like Ritu Sareen. So if you would see some big breaking stories by them, they inspire, other women, other young journalism students that, they can also be like them. Pratibha talked about young journalism student only looking at facing the camera and being journalism for them. It's definitely a mindset. You want quick, what do you say?
Fame.
Yeah, quick fame also, and they feel that there is no hard work going behind standing in front of the camera. They don't know that reporters have to study so much to give you this 2 minutes of bite. They have to collect so much of information. Yeah. We all work together. बस सारा दिन we stand under the sun, धूप में पसीना आ रहा है. एक bottle पानी हम सब men, women, we all share those bottles. किसी तरह से, we cover landslide, cover war. So when we go out there, वहाँ पे nobody has, you have to struggle even for a washroom. So I think a lot of the younger lot which sees glamour as journalists as glamorous people, they have to understand that it's tough out there. And for women, yes, a lot of us have fought our way. We have made a space for ourselves, and we have to encourage more women in journalism through giving them more chances to go out and do aggressive journalism. I think we have to remove them from those softer roles that men have typically bracketed them into. So thank you, all of you. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for joining us. And we had a really good conversation this evening. Thank you so much, Asta.
Thank you so much.
Rahul, are you there? Ma'am, can you hear me? Smita ma'am?
Yes, I can, Asta.
Ma'am, with your due permission, can I proceed with the vote of thanks?
Yes, please go ahead.
Well, it was indeed enriching to have a panel discussion about the role of gender in journalism. Gender is definitely a mental construct, a condition that was raised to suit the norms that prevailed during the ancient times when societies were governed by the principle of one-sided edicts. And with today's elaborate conversation on the nuances of how gender and gender imbalance plays a role in journalism, I am sure all of us have benefited from today's session. I would like to thank our panelists and the chair, Ms. Vinita Pandey, Ms. Smita Sharma, Dr. Nitisha Kaur, and Ms. Mandira Nair and Ms. Pratibha Jyoti ma'am for bringing their expertise to the discussion. I would like to thank the audience for making this an interactive session and to the entire team of Raisina House. Thank you.
Thank you so much.